In a small town torn by racial tensions, a beloved school teacher is falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit. As the trial unfolds, shocking revelations about a corrupt cop and a broken justice system turn the courtroom upside down, igniting a national conversation about police accountability and racial injustice. Will the truth prevail, or will an innocent woman's life be destroyed by a system stacked against her? The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place, nestled among rolling hills and peaceful neighborhoods. But lately, things had changed. Racial tensions simmered just below the surface, a growing divide that no one could ignore. The events that led to the trial had set the town on edge, with residents on both sides of the issue rallying behind their beliefs. The courtroom, a small, modest structure at the heart of the town, was packed with spectators, reporters, and family members, all eager for the highly anticipated trial to begin. The atmosphere was electric, charged with both anticipation and fear. Today, justice, whatever form it would take, was about to unfold. In the center of it all stood Jasmine, a beloved local school teacher, whose gentle smile and kind heart had made her a pillar of the community. At only 28, she was already a mother to 2 young children and 6 months pregnant with her third. Her life had been one of stability and dedication, both to her students and to her family. Her reputation as an upstanding citizen was unwavering. But now Jasmine found herself in a position she never imagined possible, accused of a crime she didn't commit. She had been charged with robbing a local convenience store in broad daylight, a crime that had shocked the small town. The police had come for her early one morning, tearing her world apart with a set of accusations that didn't make sense. Everyone who knew Jasmine knew she was innocent, but the system seemed determined to prove otherwise. The accuser, Officer Blake, had been a fixture in Willow Creek for years, a white cop with a long history of questionable decisions and accusations, particularly against people of color. His actions had raised red flags in the community for quite some time. His reputation was tarnished, though few dared speak openly about it. Yet, despite the whispers of misconduct, his word was law, and Jasmine was now his target. It was a Thursday afternoon when the incident occurred, a moment that would change Jasmine's life forever. The local convenience store, a small but bustling business in Willow Creek, was robbed at gunpoint. The store clerk, terrified and shaken, described the thief as a woman wearing a dark hoodie, her face hidden behind a scarf. The suspect fled the scene in a hurry, leaving the town in shock. The robbery was just the latest in a series of increasing crimes in the area, and the pressure to solve the case weighed heavily on the local police department. Officer Blake, desperate to make an arrest and put an end to the growing fear in the town, began his investigation. Under the intense pressure of his superiors and the mounting crime rate, Blake's frustration grew. He knew Jasmine. She was a known figure in town, respected and well-liked. But to him, her status as a school teacher made her an unlikely target for the crime. Still, he pushed forward with the theory that she might be the one behind it. Within hours of the robbery, Blake had already made his decision. He falsely identified Jasmine as the suspect. Fabricating witness statements, he claimed that several bystanders had pointed her out, even though their descriptions were vague and inconsistent. Security footage from the store, grainy and unclear, seemed to match Jasmine's appearance in a distorted way, making her the prime suspect. The footage, however, had been tampered with, making it appear more like her than it truly was. Yet, the authorities had little doubt, and the narrative Blake presented was convincing. When the arrest was made, Jasmine was blindsided. She had been home with her children that afternoon, unaware that her life was about to be turned upside down. Her arrest felt like a nightmare, a betrayal by the very system she had trusted for years. But despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, Jasmine maintained her innocence. She knew she hadn't done it, but no one seemed to believe her. As the charges were filed, she found herself in a fight not just for her freedom, but for her dignity and peace of mind. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The crowd was divided. Some believed in Jasmine's innocence, others were convinced she was guilty. But one thing was undeniable. The racial undertones of the case hung heavy over every interaction, every word spoken. The trial was more than just about the crime. It had become a symbol of a town grappling with issues of race, justice, and power. The jury, composed of a mix of people from all walks of life, watched carefully, their eyes shifting from Jasmine to the prosecutor and back again. Jasmine's defense attorney, Matthew Reynolds, was a seasoned lawyer who had built a career defending clients against wrongful accusations. A man of conviction and integrity, he knew this trial was about more than just winning. It was about exposing the truth. He stood tall, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the aggressive tactics of the state's prosecutor, Catherine Dalton, who seemed determined to paint Jasmine as a criminal. Dalton's strategy was clear. She was going to rely heavily on the testimony of Officer Blake, who had positioned himself as the key witness in this case. His confidence in his own version of events was unwavering. Officer Blake took the stand with an air of authority. Dressed in his crisp uniform, his demeanor was that of someone who believed his word was the final truth. He painted himself as a dedicated cop, a man who had been doing his job to keep the community safe. He confidently described the events of the robbery, recounting his investigation, and how Jasmine had been the one to fit the description. He even recalled the fabricated witness statements, emphasizing how the community trusted him. The jury seemed to hang on every word, but his polished performance hid the cracks in his story. When it was Jasmine's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She walked to the witness stand, her voice shaky but determined. Her eyes filled with emotion as she recounted the trauma of being wrongfully accused, the devastation of having her name dragged through the mud. "I never did this," she said, her voice breaking. "I was home with my children. I was just trying to live my life. I don't deserve this." Her words resonated deeply with the jury, especially as she spoke about the emotional toll the case had taken on her, particularly as a pregnant woman. The stress, the anxiety, the constant fear for her future. It was all taking a physical toll on her health. Matthew Reynolds took the opportunity to point out the glaring inconsistencies in Officer Blake's testimony. He emphasized how Blake's narrative was filled with contradictions, how the fabricated witness statements didn't align with the evidence, and how the security footage didn't match the description of the suspect. Slowly, the cracks in Officer Blake's story began to show, and the courtroom was left to wonder, could he really be trusted? The courtroom was on edge as the trial reached its pivotal moment. Officer Blake had just finished his testimony, and the prosecution seemed to have the case well in hand. But during the cross-examination, Jasmine's defense attorney, Matthew Reynolds, began to probe deeper. He asked Blake questions that seemed innocuous at first. Questions about his past cases, about the procedures he followed, and about his relationships with the community. But then, a bombshell dropped. Reynolds presented a series of documents to the court, internal police reports, and old case files that suggested a disturbing pattern of behavior. They weren't just about one incident, but several, in which Officer Blake had been involved in making false accusations against individuals, particularly people of color. Blake, once seen as a hero, now appeared more like a man with a dangerous agenda. Reynolds suggested that Blake had fabricated evidence in previous cases, all in an effort to close cases quickly and bolster his reputation. The implications were staggering. If Blake had done this before, how could his testimony in this case be trusted? The room buzzed with disbelief, and even the judge's stern expression faltered. But the shock didn't end there. A whistleblower, someone from within the police department, stepped forward. This officer, whose identity was kept anonymous for their safety, revealed that Blake had been known for targeting minorities in his investigations. They spoke about how Blake's actions had been swept under the rug, how other officers had turned a blind eye to his increasingly erratic behavior. The credibility of the whistleblower was questioned, of course, but their revelations only added fuel to the fire. The courtroom was now torn between believing the witnesses' account and the state's efforts to discredit them. As the tension mounted, Reynolds presented a surprise piece of forensic evidence that completely upended the case. Forensic analysis of the security footage from the robbery had been retested, this time with a focus on DNA found at the scene. The results were clear. The DNA found at the store didn't match Jasmine's. Instead, it matched Officer Blake's. The crowd gasped in shock as it became clear that Blake had planted evidence to frame Jasmine. The fingerprints on the stolen cash register had also been retested, revealing Blake's prints. The courtroom was stunned into silence. What had seemed like an open and shut case for the prosecution now appeared to be a well-orchestrated frame job by one of their own officers. Jasmine sat in disbelief, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, anger, and confusion. Officer Blake, once so confident in his position, now looked like a man caught in a trap of his own making. It was clear now, the real criminal wasn't Jasmine, but the man who had sworn to protect and serve. The moment the forensic evidence was revealed, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. The once composed and authoritative figure of Officer Blake began to unravel before everyone's eyes. As his fingerprints were exposed at the scene of the crime, and his DNA linked him to the stolen items, the shockwaves reverberated throughout the room. Jasmine's supporters, who had been holding their breath in fear and anticipation, erupted into cheers, their voices filled with disbelief and triumph. They had known all along that Jasmine was innocent. But now, the truth was irrefutable. The prosecutor, Catherine Dalton, was left scrambling to maintain control of the courtroom. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, and she could feel the mounting pressure from the public, who had witnessed the unraveling of Blake's lies. Despite the chaos, Jasmine remained astonishingly calm. Her hands, once trembling with fear, now rested firmly in her lap as she took in the full scope of the courtroom's reaction. She had spent weeks on edge, fearing that the system would fail her, but now it felt as though justice was finally within her reach. The weight of the false accusations, the stress on her pregnancy, and the emotional toll the trial had taken on her seemed to lift, even if only for a moment. She locked eyes with her defense attorney, Matthew Reynolds, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. Jasmine's strength had been tested in ways she never imagined, but in that moment, she held her head high, knowing she was on the cusp of reclaiming her life. Officer Blake, on the other hand, began to break down. His stoic expression faltered as the realization set in. His attempt to frame Jasmine had backfired spectacularly. The pressure of the courtroom, the mounting evidence, and the public's growing anger began to crush him. His hands shook, his breath quickened, and his face flushed with panic. As he sat there, surrounded by the damning evidence, his mind raced to find a way out of the mess he had created. The once proud officer was now a man on the verge of collapse, struggling to salvage his dignity. The questions began to flood the courtroom. What had motivated Officer Blake to go to such extreme lengths to frame an innocent woman? Was it personal bias, a deep-seated racial prejudice that clouded his judgment? Or was there something darker at play? Perhaps financial gain, or a personal vendetta against Jasmine? Blake's history of misconduct began to surface, and the community, once loyal to him, now turned their backs in disgust. His actions weren't just a betrayal of Jasmine, they were a betrayal of the very oath he had taken as a law enforcement officer. The courtroom had witnessed the crumbling of a man who had abused his power, and the once respected officer was now nothing more than a villain in the eyes of those he had sworn to protect. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury filed in, the weight of the case pressing heavily on everyone present. Jasmine sat at the defense table, her hands resting on her swollen belly, her eyes fixed on the door where the jury would soon emerge. After weeks of intense testimony, emotional testimony, and a courtroom filled with twists and turns, the time had finally come for the verdict. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as the foreman stood up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," the foreman said, his voice steady but somber. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jasmine Brooks, not guilty." A wave of emotion swept over Jasmine as the words sank in. Not guilty. The charges that had upended her life were now officially gone, wiped away by the truth. The courtroom erupted in applause from her supporters, some crying tears of joy while others embraced each other in relief. But Jasmine remained seated, her eyes still wide with disbelief. She had always known she was innocent, but hearing those words out loud made the reality finally set in. Relief washed over her, but it was mixed with the overwhelming weight of everything she had just endured. The emotional toll of the trial was immense, and though she was free, she knew it would take time to fully heal. As Jasmine was escorted out of the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Officer Blake, now under arrest and escorted by law enforcement. The very man who had tried to destroy her life was now facing the consequences of his actions. Blake had been placed under investigation, and his involvement in fabricating evidence and targeting minorities was now being scrutinized publicly. His fall from grace was swift, and it seemed as though the town's trust in its police force had been irreparably damaged. For Jasmine, the aftermath was a mix of emotions. While she was grateful to be exonerated, the ordeal had taken a toll on her mental and physical health. The constant stress had weighed heavily on her pregnancy, and she found herself needing time to recover, both physically and emotionally. Though life slowly began to return to normal, the shadows of the trial lingered. The community treated her with a mix of admiration and sympathy. But Jasmine could not shake the memories of the courtroom, the whispers, and the fear. She began speaking out about the injustices she had faced, determined to use her story to advocate for reform and accountability within law enforcement. But in quiet moments, as she cradled her unborn child, she reflected on how deeply this trial had changed her. The truth had set her free, but the scars of the experience would take time to fade. And as her life slowly returned to some semblance of normal, she knew the journey to healing had only just begun. The aftermath of Jasmine's exoneration rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. News of her wrongful arrest and the shocking revelation of Officer Blake's actions spread quickly, sparking a national conversation about police accountability, racial injustice, and the dangerous consequences of fabricating evidence. Her case became a symbol of what happens when the system fails its citizens, particularly people of color. Media outlets across the country covered the trial's shocking twists, and pundits debated the issues it raised. Many saw Jasmine's ordeal as part of a much larger issue, an epidemic of unjust treatment by law enforcement and the urgent need for reform. Jasmine, once a quiet, local schoolteacher, was thrust into the spotlight, but she refused to let her story be one of victimhood. Instead, she channeled her pain into advocacy. She began speaking publicly about her experience, using her voice to call for systemic change in law enforcement practices. She worked with organizations focused on police reform, urging legislators and communities to recognize the flaws in the justice system that allowed her to be falsely accused and wrongfully incarcerated. Her experience had shown her the deep inequalities that existed, and she vowed to fight for those who didn't have the platform she now had. Jasmine became a symbol of resilience and strength, embodying the hope that, one day, things could be different. As she reflected on the trial, Jasmine couldn't help but think about the strength it had taken to endure such an unimaginable ordeal. Her faith in the justice system had been shaken, tested by the actions of the very people who were supposed to protect her. But through it all, she had found a new sense of purpose. Her story, painful as it was, had the potential to inspire real change. She had endured not only for herself, but for all those who had been wrongly accused and victimized by a broken system. Looking back, Jasmine knew that the trial had flipped the system upside down. What seemed like a simple case had exposed deep flaws in law enforcement, a culture that allowed officers like Blake to operate with impunity. The case highlighted how easily the truth could be obscured, how easily justice could be manipulated, and how necessary it was to hold those in power accountable. Jasmine's fight was not just about clearing her name. It was about bringing to light the urgent need for reform, making sure that the justice system served everyone, not just the privileged few.